Our panelist today is, oh, that is not the right thing. Sorry, our panelist today is going to be Lynn Sosnoskie. Lynn is the new assistant professor of weed ecology and management for specialty crops at Cornell Agritech in Geneva, New York. While she's here today to focus on vineyard management, her position includes all fruit and vegetables with a particular emphasis on herbicide-resistant weeds. With that, I'll hand it over to Lynn.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen, and this might take a minute to get up because I need to pull up the talk. Is it up, Becky?
Yeah, that looks wonderful.
Okay, great. All right. So thanks so much for coming. Obviously, we're gonna talk about grapes and growing grapes without glyphosate today. So let's just start off with the obligatory slides on why weeds are a problem in grapes or any cropping system. And that's going to be because they are the direct competitors for our crops for water, light, and nutrients. In addition to that, large vegetation that develops in vineyards can impact the deposition of crop protection chemicals. They can provide habitat for both invertebrate and vertebrate pests. They can alter microclimates that influence disease development, frost freeze protection, and influences on that ability, and then interference with harvest operations. This was some work that was done at NCSU a couple of years ago, looking at the weeks that newly planted vineyards were kept weed-free after planting, and the increase in grape stem cross-section. And basically what they found, the longer you can keep newly planted grapes, keep that area immediately below the vines clean, you're going to increase your stem diameter. So you're going to increase your vine growth. So this is why we're really concerned about weeds and weed management, particularly in new systems. Now, to build any kind of weed management program, we need to know who's there. And so I'm just going to take a minute or two to emphasize scouting and weed identification. So scouting is really important because basically it's going to tell you who's there, and that's going to help you devise a management program, and it's also going to help you determine how well they are being managed with the strategies that you're employing. So through scouting, regular assessment of your weed communities, you're going to understand how to make your control practices more effective and economically sustainable, because you're going to build control practices that are specialized to target the species that are there. Scouting is going to identify the evolution and introduction of herbicide resistance in the system. This is really something that's of very much concern to me as herbicide-resistant weeds spread throughout the United States. And it's also going to identify any new threats that enter a system, a weed that hasn't been here previously, and then maybe expands its range into the area that you're growing. So I always get this question, is there an app out there that can identify a weed from a photo? Can I just take a picture? And is there something that will tell me what that weed is? And actually, yes, there are several, and I'm just going to go over them really quickly. So there's two that I mean, there's more than two, but there's two that I probably have evaluated more frequently than the others, and that's going to be iNaturalist and PlantNet. And both of these apps, and if you go into your app store on your cell phone, both of these use recognition software to compare your pictures to image galleries and get an identification. So what you do is you go in, you download the apps, and then they're going to give you this ability to either take a picture or upload a picture and submit it and get some sort of information back about what you're looking at. So this is what the platform for PlantNet looks like. If you open it up, basically it says you have a new observation. Do you want to take a picture right then and there with your phone camera, or do you want to select a picture from your gallery? So you say, I selected this picture from my gallery. This is common lamb's quarters. And then I tell PlantNet what it's looking at, a leaf. And then I submit the results, and it gives me, or I submit the image, and it gives me back a set of results telling me what it thinks it is. And in this case, the #1 hit is common lamb's quarters. And then from there, you can access more information. If you're connected to cellular service or Wi-Fi, it'll take you to the Wikipedia site for that weed. The next one is iNaturalist. Again, you do the same thing. You take a picture, you upload a picture, you submit it. It's gonna say, you know, what am I looking at? And then it's gonna give you a list of what it thinks are the top species that your image could be. And in this case, I submitted the exact same image to iNaturalist, and it popped back out common lamb's quarters Chenopodium album, which it is. Now, one thing I'm gonna say about both of these apps is do not rely on them alone for your weed ID. They will try to identify a plastic flower, okay? You know, make sure you double check any ID. Use a good book like Weeds of the West. Use a website that you are comfortable with and that you have confidence in for double checking the identification, or get in touch with an extension personnel or someone like myself, you know, for confirmation. Again, you know, they're good tools, but they're not perfect tools. So that was my little spiel about making sure you identify your weeds and maybe some new tools out there you weren't aware of. So before we can even talk about weed management in the crop, we really need to be thinking about weed management before we even plant our vineyards. And site selection, or starting clean, is going to be really, really crucial, particularly where we're dealing with perennial species. So for instance, this is a picture I took of a very young walnut planting in California in the Sacramento Valley, and that's field bindweed, Convolvulus arvensis. Now, what's happening in the Sacramento Valley of California and in the Central Valley is we have a lot of tree crops going in that are being planted on land that was once planted to annual crops that had bindweed populations develop. And now those bindweed populations and those perennial weed populations are transferring over to our tree and vine systems that might not have a real wide range of control strategies available to them while they're very young. So site selection is crucial. And if you've got difficult to control species like perennials, so for instance, field bindweed, hedge bindweed, Canada thistle, yellow nutsedge, Johnson grass, curly dog, goldenrod, among many others, avoid those sites or consider aggressively managing them physically or chemically before getting established. So with respect to physical management, when we're talking about soil disturbance for perennial weed control, the point of using soil disturbance is basically to go in and cultivate, you know, potentially every 10 to 14 days, depending on the species. And what you're doing is you're wanting to deplete those underground nutrient reserves. So what you're going to have is basically the plant's going to push new growth, you go in and kill it, push new growth, go in and kill it, push new growth, go in and kill it. So slowly just deplete those nutrient reserves so it doesn't have the ability to push new growth anymore. Now you've got to do this frequently enough, because what you don't want to do is what it pushes to start sending nutrients back down and rebuilding what's been lost. Cultivation can also desiccate potentially regenerative fragments. And for something like field bindweed, they found rhizome fragments about as small as an inch can regrow and become reestablished. So in places like California, you know, there was some really intense, you know, tillage operations going on where we've got some of these problems, such as deep plowing with a reclamation blade to sever above ground biomass from those deep root systems, or using moldboard plows that we can go in and bury nutlets of nutsedge below the emergent zone. Now, intense soil disturbance is obviously going to be problematic with respect to soil structure and soil health and erosion. So cover cropping can be a partner in land preparation events, and there's a lot of people at your associated universities who do a lot of work with cover crops. So if this is something you're thinking about, definitely contact them, you know, for the best management plans to protect soil health. Understand that if you don't cultivate frequently enough, you can actually make the situation worse. Cultivation can exhaust that stored energy and desiccate those structures, but infrequent disturbance can just move root and rhizome fragments and bulbs around throughout the field and allow them to become reestablished. And we have seen this done. I've seen it done in person. And, you know, this is actually one of my research plots in California where that's field bindweed that we're picking up and dragging through the field. Now, herbicides are often used with the management of perennial weeds, and in particular systemic herbicides, and primarily in the groups WSSA4, which is going to be the synthetic auxins, and WSSA9, which is going to be glyphosate. And these can be effective tools because they're translocated throughout the target plants, and they kill more than just the tissue than what was treated. So unlike a contact herbicide, it's not just burning stuff off. Single applications are not likely to be effective, and you really have to time these applications to maximize the capture of the herbicide, so have enough biomass above the ground to actually capture these herbicides and make sure that the systemic movement of the herbicides is going away from the treated tissues to the meristems. So this actually just really kind of highlights that you really need to know the biology and the ecology of the weeds that we're dealing with, because we need to be able to target the time when these perennial species are going to be most sensitive to control. And it might not be just like, say, a pure calendar date that you all go in at this time on September 1. That might not be the most ideal time for all perennial species. So that's why it's really important to understand biology and ecology. So I'm just going to throw this up there with like understanding, you know, the weeds themselves. So this is a theoretical bindweed control curve for field bindweed. And this is something I did for my growers in California. When the weed is starting to emerge in, you know, early spring, we're going to have insufficient biomass to capture those herbicides. So you can spray it, but we've got a monster root system that goes about 30 feet deep, and we have very little above ground tissue to get enough herbicide to get into that root system. At the same time, the emerging shoots mean we've got flow and movement away from those roots. In the fall, you know, we might be seeing natural senescence due to disease like powdery mildew or pest infestations that are reducing the vigor and reducing the amount of biomass that's able to capture those herbicides. We also might have bud dormancy limiting translocation to meristems. So we often talk about, well, let's put fall applications down because that's when the phloem is going down to the roots. But you know, how late is too late? How late till we're really having shut down and we're not translocating anymore? So this is why, again, we need to really understand the biology of the species we're dealing with. So there's just going to be one slide here with respect to non-chemical control strategies. We are gonna focus on herbicides, but understand that herbicides are not the only tools in the toolbox. You know, there is cover cropping to replace the vegetation on a vineyard floor between rows. This is going to require management of that cover crop as well. So thoughts about low growing or slow growing species or cultivars that can reduce those needs. Mulches such as, you know, or organic mulches like straw or green waste, or inorganic mulches like plastics can be effective. The cost and the ease of the sourcing of those materials could be a question. There's, you know, evidence that it can be related to vertebrate pest damage and supporting voles and other pests that are unwanted that can damage bark. There's also the very limited control of perennial species with mulches. The degradation of our organic mulches can actually facilitate weeds as they break down and the weeds start to grow in those organic mulches. And the presence of mulches might interfere with the application of other strategies for weed management. Cultivation can really good for control of seedlings. It's a bit more difficult to manage perennials, and as we talked previously, can actually increase the size of the problem if it's done too infrequently. Intense cultivation or improper cultivation can result in injury to trunks and roots, which can lead to reduced vigor, crown gall, and collar rot. So there's always trade-offs associated with strategies that we want to be using. Now, we are here to talk about glyphosate and herbicides. primarily. A lot of people want to know about that. So let's just take a moment to talk about herbicides and frankly, how much we use in the US. We use a lot of herbicides. These are optimized tools. There's a lot of money that's spent in the development of herbicides, and they are evaluated over a wide range of conditions and a wide range of weed species. So they're effective. And we use a lot of them relative to other pesticides across all of the sectors in the US. 89% of all pesticide use is herbicide use. Or I'm sorry, 89% of the herbicide use in the US is in the ag sector. We're using about 0.6 billion pounds of AI. This is 2012 data out of a total 1 billion pounds AI. Of total pesticides, 0.6 billion is herbicides. That also equates to a lot of money. Of the $13.9 billion that were spent in 2012, herbicides accounted for $6.2 billion, with the majority of those expenditures in the ag sector. We do use herbicides in grapes. This is data from California that I got off of Dr. Brad Hansen. And this is looking at the top active ingredients that were applied to herbicides in both 2014 and 2015. And we can see that glyphosate is actually on the top. It's a herbicide that's used across a lot of production environments, whether it's agronomic or horticultural. And we can see out of 918,000 acres, a little over 630,000 acres in 2015 were treated with Roundup. So just some quick information about glyphosate. A little bit about the herbicide itself. It's an amino acid biosynthesis inhibitor. Specifically, it inhibits the EPS-PS enzyme, and that inhibits a shikimic acid pathway. And this is important because this is involved in the synthesis of aromatic amino acids, tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. And amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and those are structural components of plants, and they are components of proteins that carry out the duties that are specified by the information encoded in the genes. And that's why interfering with amino acid synthesis, interfering with protein synthesis, is an effective tool for controlling plants. You're basically shutting the plants down and interfering with their ability to grow and develop. So now glyphosate has been called a once-in-a-lifetime herbicide, but don't confuse once in a lifetime with perfect. There is no perfect herbicide. All herbicides can fail, and glyphosate is prone to failure too. And that's for various reasons, such as spray water quality. Hard water, if it's not properly, if we don't add the proper adjuvants to it, can reduce glyphosate efficacy. Dust, bindweed can glyphosate can bind to dust on leaf surfaces, and that's going to reduce glyphosate efficacy. When we also have the development of resistance with 43 species worldwide now being resistant to Roundup. And this says 43, but it's 48, sorry. These are the top countries with respect to glyphosate resistance. And you can see the United States is one of them with 17 species with glyphosate resistance. Now, if we're thinking that glyphosate resistance is just a function of agronomic crops, I'm kind of here to tell you that that's not true. You know, we do see glyphosate resistant species in our row crop systems, such as soybeans and corn, cotton and wheat. But it has developed in specialty crop systems, such as orchards. We have 9 species that are known to have developed glyphosate resistance, or expected or believed to have developed glyphosate resistance in orchards, and 7 species which are believed to have developed glyphosate resistance in grapes. And this is going to include some of those species that we see present here on the slide. So that's going to be horseweed, hairy fleabane, Palmer amaranth, jungle rice, and water hemp. So what are the alternatives? We're talking about glyphosate, and if we remove this herbicide from the toolbox, what are the alternatives? So if you're kind of interested in the herbicides that we've got out there and how they're classified, If you go to hracglobal.com, you can actually find a poster about the herbicide modes of action, and they're broken up by their WSSA groups, but they're also broken up by how they work. So light activation of reactive oxygen species, or whether they interfere with cellular metabolism or cell division and growth. So definitely, if you want to take a deeper dive into herbicides, check that out. But I bring this up because I want to highlight these are the modes of action. These are the WSSA groups that we have herbicides in grape systems too. Now, we might not have all of those hexagons. We might only have a hexagon or maybe 2 hexagons in any of those highlighted boxes, but these are the categories where we have tools. So we're going to start and we're going to break down the tools based off of the types of herbicides, and that's going to be post-emergence herbicides or pre-emergence herbicides. So post-emergence, that's going to be our foliar herbicides. Those are going to be those burn down treatments to standing weeds in the field. And these products can either be contact, so they're going to control the tissue that they're actively applied to, or they are going to be systemic. They're going to be products that can be translocated in the plant from the area that they're treated to, say, like a growing meristem where they're active. We also have pre-emergence herbicides. These are going to be products that are applied to the soil. We call them our soil applied herbicides, our residual herbicides. And they're going to act on emerging weeds. Note, they do not kill the seeds in the soil. These are not sterilants. They act on the emerging weeds. So as those seeds germinate and those seedlings start to grow, that's when the herbicide is taken up, and that's when it moves into those seedlings and has activity. So these products, again, applied to the soil, they can provide some residual control. It's going to vary very much in the length of time that they're active, from weeks to months, depending on the herbicide, depending on the soil, depending on the environment. And it's also important to note is that some of these products might actually have the ability to burn down small emerged weeds, but please do not rely on them as a post product necessarily. A lot of them, if they have early post activity, it's expected that there will be a tank mix partner, a post-emergence tank mix partner to make sure that standing vegetation is controlled. So if we look at the post-emergence active ingredients that are registered for use in grapes, and I'm going to focus, I'm New York based, so I am going to focus on New York. My apologies to other people from other regions. Trust me, your extension service will have these same types of materials available for you. So for the active ingredients, post-emergence active ingredients that we're looking at for grapes in New York, this comes down to 4 WSSA groups. This is going to be WSSA1, our ACCase inhibitors. This is going to be our grass herbicides. WSSA10, this is a glutamine synthase inhibitor. This is the active ingredient glyphosate. WSSA14, which is a PPO inhibitor. This is carfentrazone. And WSSA22, which is a photosystem 1 electron diverter, and this is paraquat. So just want to bring up this slide again. We had talked about, say, the herbicides that were being used in California. This is just a highlight. Here's the post herbicides highlighted in red. So yeah, we were using a lot of glyphosate. Maybe in 2015, we weren't seeing as much of those other post-emergence herbicides being used, but they do see some, some role, at least in California's production environment. So of the ones that we have registered in New York, glyphosate was the 3rd most applied product, paraquat after that, and then carfentrazone, Shark in California, AIM here in New York was down in number 10. So just some information about the post-emergence herbicides broken up by category. The WSSA1, these are the ACCase inhibitors. These are going to be the FOPs and the DIMs, if you're familiar with those chemistries. They are systemic, grass-specific herbicides, and that's going to include foxtails, crabgrass, barnyard grass, witchgrass, ryegrasses, etc. This is not going to get nutsedges or rushes. So just because nutsedges like yellow nutsedge or purple nutsedge and rushes might be grass-like, that doesn't mean that they are sensitive to the grass-specific herbicides. Another thing that I do want to mention is that grasses need to be actively growing. Grasses that are stressed due to temperature, grasses that are stressed due to drought are not going to be effectively controlled by these systemic herbicides. So it might seem counterintuitive, but you need a happy, vigorous, actively growing plant. So the herbicides that we have available are clethodim, which is a New York restricted material, non-bearing. Total max use has got a lower rate for Long Island. Fusilade, non-bearing, not used for Long Island, and then sethoxydim, which has both a bearing and a non-bearing label. WSSA group 10, which is a glutamine synthase inhibitor. This is glufosinate. This herbicide is technically considered broad spectrum, but it's better on broadleaves. This is going to include horseweed, pigweeds, nightshades, purslane, velvet leaf, and ragweed. It's not registered for use in Long Island. It's a contact herbicide, but it has limited systemic activity. So it sometimes falls in this contact/systemic group. Do not treat it like a systemic herbicide. Plants must be small when they are treated to really get good control. And do not confuse glufosinate with glyphosate. I've seen growers do it. Glyphosate is a true systemic herbicide. Glufosinate is not. This product, like most contact herbicides, is not going to provide a lot of control of perennials, so expect limited suppression with species like horse nettle and Canada thistle. With respect to some of the other post-emergence herbicides, the category 14, the PPO inhibitors, this group of herbicides are better on annual broadleaves. This is going to be carfentrazone or AIM. It is a contact herbicide, and again, weeds need to be small, and we're looking at like 2 to 3 leaf stage. You've got to get them while they're young, or else all you're going to do is maybe burn off like the top amount of tissue, and you're going to see regrowth from latent buds. It can be effective on pigweeds, velvet leaf, ragweed, but like we said previously, not necessarily against perennials. You might burn off some of that above ground tissue, but you're not going to get that herbicide movement that you want to see, that the systemic herbicides can provide. WSSA 22. These are photosystem 1 electron inverters. This is paraquat. It is a broad spectrum, but again, gets annual species. Gramoxone, paraquat, is a federally restricted herbicide. It's a good contact herbicide, and again, good coverage is needed, so it's not necessarily going to be effective against perennials. Burn down of above ground tissue, but not much more. Higher spray volume improves your coverage, which improves your chance of control. I think what's important to understand about paraquat, if you're not already, is that there's a lot of new restrictions in place with this herbicide because it is a particularly dangerous herbicide. It's very caustic. It can cause damage to, nasal tissue. It can cause damage to alimentary tissue. It can cause damage to eyes, to skin. So purchasers, applicators, mixers, loaders, tank cleaners, any of these herbicide products containing paraquat are going to have to be certified to use restricted materials. And they're going to have to complete paraquat specific training and pass an exam every 3 years to use this product, which can be found, the exam and the information can be found at usparaquattraining.com. There's also going to be restrictions. There's already restrictions on large volumes for closed container systems. There's going to be, I believe, coming restrictions on smaller volumes. So be aware of this with paraquat. So, the one thing I haven't talked about with Roundup, and I'm not a toxicologist and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to be discussing, how dangerous is it. If you're interested in risk and exposure evaluations and assessment, Dan Wickstead from Cornell University does a great talk, and you should turn to him for more information. But I'm not going to dismiss, things like caution words and restricted use requirements. So if we're looking at direct substitutes for glyphosate, and we should be aware of signal words and the restrictions of some of these products that are out there. So glyphosate has right now, it's got the EPA. All the evidence suggests it has a caution word, or a caution as its signal word. Carbendazole and fluazepop also have cautions, but some of the other products that could be substituted, like clethodim, glufosinate, and sethoxydim, have signal words, whereas paraquat has a danger word. Some of these products are restricted use, whether federally or in New York, and some of these products can't be used in Nassau and Suffolk counties. So be thinking about this. If you're substituting a product for a product, signal words are important, and the restrictions on the product are also important. Some general notes about post-emergence herbicides. Weed size matters, but so does coverage and droplet size for some of these products, and we'll discuss this in a second. Make sure you're using appropriately labeled surfactants. All surfactants or adjuvants are not created equal. So be very paying close attention to what you're putting in the tank in addition to the herbicides. Weather and weed vigor is going to impact performance. Perennials are going to require multiple treatments, even with systemic products. Pay attention to vine age and bearing restrictions, as well as seasonal timing recommendations on the labels. Not all these herbicides can be used all times of the year. And understand that spray contact to stems, foliage, blooms can cause injury to the vines. So one thing I did want to talk about is we often think about, weed size, make sure we get the weeds while they're smaller. Make sure that we're using enough, spray volume to get good coverage. But don't forget about nozzles. And some of these products are going to have label recommendations regarding their nozzles, and that's going to include glufosinate, Rely 280. So this is part of the label for Rely 280, where it says that you need to use nozzles and a pressure that generate a medium to coarse spray size droplet. Very coarse or extremely coarse or ultra coarse nozzles are not going to give you the coverage that's going to give you satisfactory weed control. So be aware of nozzle recommendations that do exist on labels. Definitely be checking out and reading that. And this is just something I pulled up about some of the nozzles out there that people might be using, like the 8002s, the 8004s, etc. The nozzle number is on the y-axis, the PSI is on the X here, and this is the kind of droplet size classification based on nozzle size and pressure that you can expect. So if you're using, a product like glufosinate, you've got to be aware, again, you don't want the fines, but because we don't want the drift, but we also don't want the very coarse droplet size either, because of potential efficacy concerns. So we've covered the post-emergence herbicides. There's also the pre-emergent active ingredients that are registered for grapes. This is in New York. We have a couple of different categories, such as the ALS inhibitors, ribsulfuron, our microtubule inhibitors. These are going to be our yellow herbicides. The WSSA 5 and 7, and I put the little 7 in quotation marks because the HVAC poster I put you there before seems to delete the 7 and kicks everything into 5. So I need to read up on that a little bit more, but that's going to be your photosystem 2 inhibitors, which are diuron and simazine. We also have the 12s, which are the pigment inhibitors. That's going to be solecam or fluorazone. The PPO inhibitors, we had PPO inhibitors that are post-emergence herbicides. Oxaflurofin and flumioxazin are also PPO inhibitors. These are going to be pre-emergent with some post-emergent burn town. Napropamide, which is going to be a Devernol, WSSA 15, and then our cell wall inhibitors, which are going to be diclobinil and indaziflam. Again, the same thing with indaziflam, or with diclobinil, the WSSA 20. That category seems to disappear in the new HVAC classification. This just shows you the pre-emergence herbicides and kind of how prevalent they were used in California grapes in 2015 and what products were being used. So looking at the pre-emergence herbicides, looking at the ALS inhibitors, these are broad spectrum. It is broad spectrum. We only have matrix. This is going to include some barnyard grass, crabgrass, foxtails, witchgrass. It's going to include horseweed if you're concerned about glyphosate-resistant horseweed. It's also going to include lamb's quarters, pigweeds, and purslane. Unless your pigweeds are ALS resistant, and we do have a lot of pigweed species with ALS resistance, so we need to be thinking about that. This is a pre-emergent herbicide with some early post activity. So again, consider a post-tank mix partner if weeds are present. Do not rely necessarily on these pre-early posts for burn down, particularly with larger plants. It's got a very short residual time in the soil, 60 to 90 days, unlike something like Allion, which is much more persistent. Sequential applications, 30 days apart, or tank mix partners are going to be needed for season-long control, and there's vine age restrictions. With our WSSA3, our yellow herbicides, these are microtubule inhibitors. These products are better on grasses, so they probably are going to require some tank mix partners to get more of the broadleaves that we might be concerned with. This comes down to Oryzalin, which can be used on low organic matter soils, not recommended where organic matter is greater than 5%. This is Prowl H2O. By the way, Prowl 3.3 EC is registered for non-bearing vineyards only, whereas Prowl H2O is registered for bearing and non-bearing. And then there's Protamide, which is Kerr. Unlike the other two microtubule inhibitors, this product has some early post activity. It can control annual and perennial grasses, and it will pick up some annual broadleaf weeds, although control might be reduced with greater than 4% organic matter. Degradation occurs at temperatures greater than 55 degrees Fahrenheit. There's vine age restrictions, etc., that you can find on the label. The next group, the photosystem 2 inhibitors. These products, unlike the ones we just talked about, are going to be better on broadleaves, including horseweed. You're going to need tank mixing for management of season-long management of grasses. And we also need to be thinking about rotations because we do have resistance to these herbicide groups. So rotations and tank mixing are advised. These come down to diuron and simazine. Vine age restrictions for both. Simazine is a New York restricted product. Some formulations of diuron are as well. With diuron, 2 applications 90 days apart on newer labels. Simazine, low pH soils are going to enhance degradation, and that's going to reduce residual control. Solcam is WSSA12. This is naflurazone, carotenoid biosynthesis inhibitor. This is, again, a grass herbicide, primarily a grass herbicide, season-long annual grass and some perennial grass suppression. Not for use on Long Island, vine age restrictions. Again, tank mix to expand the controlled spectrum for the broadleaves. It's not going to really pick up some of those other important species. PPO inhibitors, better on broadleaves, including pigweeds, horseweed, and nightshades than the grasses. Chateau, pre and some early post, again, tank mix partner. The maximum use rate is going to be lower for sandier soils if vines are less than 3 years in age. Split applications might be better where there's heavier soils, a lot of precipitation or high weed density to achieve that season-long control, but you've got a shield after bud break. Oxyflorphin, vine age, and there are trellis restrictions and requirements for use of this product. Vines have to be older than 3 years of age unless trellised at least 3 feet above the soil surface. And again, tank mix partner, tank mix partner, tank mix partner to pick up grasses. The WSSA15 group, these are very long chain fatty acid inhibitors. This is going to be Deferenol and Napropamide. Better on grasses. It is susceptible to photodegradation, especially in late spring and early summer, so you need rapid incorporation, so a rainfall event within 24 hours. And I'm highlighting this because I want to kind of show you the difference in stability between the next herbicide. So it controls a similar spectrum of weeds as the yellow herbicides, or WSSA-3, that's going to be pendimethalin, prowl, or rhizoline, surflim. But ragweed is a common broadleaf escape. So the next group, the WSSA 2029, the cell wall biosynthesis inhibitors, broad spectrum control. Caseron actually has some perennial suppression. So unlike a lot of the pre-emergence products, it can actually get some perennial plants. It does have some early post activity. This has got to be applied when temps are below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're looking November 15th to February 15th because of volatility losses. Volatility losses are also going to increase when the soil is dry. There's vine age restrictions with products. Allion is New York restricted and not used for Long Island, not for use on sandy or gravelly soils. I have seen Allion injury to almonds and pecans out in California and in the Southwest where it was used on gravelly soils. There are planting depth restrictions, 12 inches of soil between the roots and the surface. You can't have the cracks in the soil because you can't have the Allion moving down into the root zone. Vine age restrictions, plant back restrictions. This is a little bit more stable. So rainfall within 21 days. Now I didn't highlight all of the products. You know, definitely read the label and look how long these products can remain on the soil surface before they need to be incorporated. But I do want to highlight, they're not all the same. Some are going to have much shorter periods before incorporation is required as opposed to others. That's all I'm highlighting this for. Be aware. If you don't have a rainfall event, if you don't have the irrigation capacity, you know, how the residual activity of these products can be reduced. So soil contact is really important for effective control. Litter and residue can interfere with the deposition of pre-emergence herbicides and can reduce efficacy. The stability of these pre-herbicides differ. That's why I wanted to highlight that previous slide, and that's going to influence activation requirements. So that has to be a thought when making applications. They differ in their solubility and adsorption potential to the soil, which affects leaching, which can affect environmental contamination, but also residual time and efficacy. Rates differ in response to soil type and weed identity. This can also impact injury potential to grapes, the rates that you're using. Some products have that early post activity, but I wouldn't rely on it as the post only control. And obviously pay attention to vine age restrictions, seasonality of applications, and spray injury potential. I wanted to bring up the raking or the litter and the impacts of litter on performance. This was a study to determine, this was done by John Roncaroni out in California, to determine if leaf litter interferes with herbicide activity. He did this in Merlot grapes in the Napa Valley. He went out on 12/19/2007, so it was an older study, and he raked half the plots and he didn't rake half the plots. And then he put down 10 ounces of Chateau and 24 ounces of Roundup, and then came back and evaluated herbicide performance. He did it immediately for obviously the Roundup control, but he also looked at the long-term control. So this is weed control based from a scale of 1, which is poor, to 10, excellent. Following these herbicide applications and looking at the initial cover on 12/19, and he compared raked to non-raked. And you can see on both March at 93 days after treatment and in May, 138 days, we had better control where we had raked the soil surface and removed that biomass that could interfere with the deposition of herbicides as compared to where it was just left in place. And these numbers, the plus 125, plus 80, plus 50, that is the percent increase in control by raking and removing that litter, that vegetation from the soil surface. Wanted to bring up injury, even though we're talking pre-emergence herbicides, and sometimes we're real careful about how we use the post-emergence products. You know, we don't want the post-emergence products to drift and cause damage. Pre-emergence herbicides can also cause injury. They can cause injury moving into the root zone. They can cause injury if they come into contact with the foliage. We had talked about indaziflam and the potential for it to injure young grapevines. This is actually Allion. This was actually at a UCA in our research station. These are raisin grapes that are less than, I think they were 3, 4, 5 years old. They were very young on a sandy soil, and this is Allion injury to grapevines. So just be aware, pre-emergent herbicides can cause injury. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, we were talking about alternatives to glyphosate. These alternatives to glyphosate are not necessarily free of the herbicide resistance, potentials that develop. This is the current status of herbicide resistance in the world. We have 512 unique cases of herbicide-resistant weeds globally. Of our 26 known herbicide modes of action, we have resistance somewhere out there to 23 of them and to 166 different herbicides. So let's be aware of the potential for herbicide injury or herbicide resistance to develop across all of our herbicide chemistries. And that means in grapes too. There are 36 cases reported of herbicide injury or herbicide resistance worldwide. The first case was in 1978 in Switzerland, and there's resistance that's been reported in 12 countries to date, the United States being one of them. And if we're looking at the herbicide categories where we've got resistance developing, we've got, and I believe this is in the United States, this is to the ACCase, the ALS herbicides, the photosystem 2, the APSPS, the glutamine synthesis is going to be glufosinate, and the photosystem 1. Or no, maybe, oh no, these are the herbicides. These are resistances, the herbicide categories where we've had resistance worldwide develop in grapes. So these categories. So we're looking at the grass herbicides, matrix, diuron, glyphosate, glufosinate, and paraquat. In the United States, in our grape systems, all of the resistances to date that have been reported that I've been able to find have developed in California. That's been in like Caniza bonariensis and canadensis, so that's fleabane, and that canadensis is horseweed. So we have resistance to glyphosate in those species, as well as resistance to paraquat, and I think it should also say paraquat to the canadensis as well. Echinocloa colonna, this is jungle rice. This is kind of a close cousin to barnyard grass. It has resistance to glyphosate that developed in vineyard systems. We do have ryegrass that's developed resistance to glufosinate, as well as glyphosate, paraquat, and cefoxidime. One thing I do want to mention is that, we do talk about herbicide resistance and the use of herbicides or the overuse of herbicides and resistance developing, but understanding weeds can be develop resistance. I don't want to say resistance. Weeds can adapt to any strategy that we are using. And there are other management practices that can select for weed species that will become dominant in a system. So for instance, mowing, close mowing in turf selects for weeds that are either perennial or prostrate or can withstand those mowing operations. So mowing will select for weeds that tolerate it. Hand weeding, we have selected for weeds that mimic crops in appearance. You can't tell the weed species apart from the crops, so it's very difficult to hand weed them out. Irrigation, something as simple as irrigation. We thought in California, oh, okay, if we switch to drip irrigation, because irrigation, water concerns are really important in a dry climate. If we switch to drip irrigation, well, when we went away from surface irrigation, we saw a decrease in a lot of weed species. But guess what? We selected for field bindweed, which has roots that can go 30 feet deep. That doesn't rely on surface irrigation. It doesn't have that shallow root system, that thrives in a furrow irrigated or a sprinkler irrigated system. So just be aware of that we need to diversify strategies regardless of what we're using. So what are the trade-offs or risks that we need to consider? If we're going to be eliminating glyphosate from a system, you know, we're removing a tool, right? So we have to be thinking about what tools are going to replace it, you know, and what that means for the economic costs, both the short and the long term. That's going to include labor requirements. You know, what does that mean? If you're going to have perennial species that aren't going to be actively managed by some of the other tools you have available to you, do you have to go to more hand weeding? And what does that do to a budget sheet? There's also, you know, one thing I'm interested in is the potential for mechanization and weed control on the horizon. There are some, you know, automated robots out there for use in vineyard systems, and I'm really curious about investigating them and evaluating and seeing what that means, or see and spray technology for directed herbicide applications. You know, crop safety or the products that we're going to have to use in place of Roundup. You know, is there potential for, you know, chemical damage to the vines with how they're being used? If we switch to, you know, more intense cultivation, is there potential for physical damage? So that's a trade-off. There's also the mobility or the environmental safety that might be associated with the mobility of the herbicides, the impacts that other additional strategies might have on pollinators or beneficial insects, those non-targets, or soil runoff if we go to cultivation. And then there's personal safety. How does changing your weed management strategy change the safety of your workers? How does it change PPE requirements? You know, we talked about signal words. What does that mean for the sun and heat exposure of people working in vineyards if there's more hand weeding? So there's trade-offs and risks that need to be considered. So any management strategy, glyphosate or not, you have to be thinking, what's the substitute for the product, you know, or the tool that I'm eliminating? What are the substitutes? And yeah, you have to be thinking about efficacy, but you have to be thinking about a lot of other strategies. So you have to make the best system or the best decision for a system as a whole. And this isn't as simple as swapping out a herbicide for another. Okay, this is my last slide. This is my contact information. I am located at Cornell Agritech in Geneva. I've been on 6 months, and frankly, research operations are shutting down in light of current environment. So it'll be interesting this coming spring and summer. If you are on social media, you can find me on social media at Veg Fruit Weed Science, and that's Twitter, and at Specialty Crop Weed Science. That is my Instagram account. And I guess that is my last slide. So I will let you jump back in, Becky.
Great. So we have some time for questions, and we have a lot of them.
Oh, gosh, okay.
So we'll take a few and see what we can do in the time we've got.
Okay.
And whatever you have time for. So who at Cornell can we talk to about cover crops, mulches, and cultivation for new wine grapes?
Yeah, so actually that's a great question. I think any of the viticulture extension specialists are probably going to be those people. Maybe I'm throwing Hans Walter Peterson or yourself under the bus, but talk to those. And I think Tim Martinson is probably, since I am so new and I am just getting established, Tim Martinson can probably talk to that. I know Dr. Justine Vandenheuvel has done work with cover crops and mulches, particularly at looking at how to reduce vigor in wine grape. So I think those people are the people who probably to talk to. Great. The next question is the weed slayer. I do not have any experience with weed slayer. I have worked with suppressed herbicide and I have worked with Axe. So unfortunately, I do not have experience with weed slayer. So I can't answer that. For people who might be interested in organic herbicides, I'm going to be putting out a trial this summer.
Great.
So the next question, which is one I probably should have prepared for, and I have not. Actually, maybe Tim could answer that question himself, as I'm going to say I'm actually not familiar with the evidence of glyphosate moving into the berries directly. Admittedly, I've been a lot more focused on, in the systems I've worked in, on weed control and not so much translocation in the perennial crops themselves. So if Tim Martinson or Becky, I'll let you chime in, because you've probably been paying attention more to the itself, whereas maybe I'm more focused on the superficial vine damage.
Yeah, Tim Martinson here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The only evidence I'm not aware of any residues in berries, but I do know that timing of glyphosate can make a big difference in vine uptake and damage. We feel that before the suckers on the vine are about 6 inches long, it's safe to spray over the top. If you did the same thing in the middle, and the glyphosate won't be translocated. But if you did the same thing in July, then you're going to come up with uptake by the vine and carryover effects. I don't know if that answers your question, but it raised another question for Lynn, maybe, in that if we substitute glufosinate for glyphosate, I mean, the timing is going to be different and so forth. But apart from the hype, is that going to be a safer thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. It is not that it's not a systemic herbicide. There is like limited movement. I'll get back to you on that to see if there's actually been any kind of evaluations or any work done on looking at glufosinate movement within the plants. I think with glufosinate, I'm not going to say that there isn't the potential, but my more concern is if someone goes in, trying to burn down weeds that are too tall and has got a high boom and droplets moving and causing injury. We did do some work with glufosinate on almonds and pistachios in California, where we were looking at injury to trunks. And with that herbicide and those crops, we did see like trunk cankers and gummosis develop. But I'm not familiar with the literature for grapes, and I haven't done the work myself.
Great. You want to go to the next question, Lynn?
Yeah, so with the tank mix partner, the labeled tank mix partner, I'm going to plead ignorance to this with in a grape system. I am new to grapes, so I do not know off the top of my head what the appropriately labeled tank mix partner is. I would have to look it up. I have done some work looking at with bindweed if we could increase the efficacy of bindweed suppression by combining matrix and glyphosate, and I did not see that. With the bindweed, how close is too close to treat with glyphosate? Oh, right. Yeah, exposing the roots of the grapevine to glyphosate if the bindweed is growing close. So yeah, you're going to want to, avoid the potential for contact with the with herbicides. I'm not sure that I'd want to be getting out there and spraying, that bindweed that's growing up the trunk itself with the glyphosate for the potential of, getting it to come into contact, but particularly with the foliage. With respect to the trunk and the roots, I literally just downloaded a paper about mobilization of glyphosate, potential for root uptake, that I'm taking home to read. But if you want to get in touch with me and my contact information, I can provide you with more information about that. But again, yeah, I'd be very careful about glyphosate that's growing up. I would want to keep the spray from coming into contact. More potential, I'm thinking I'm thinking potential of getting up in the leaves. Excuse me.
Yeah, if I can chime in here,
Please.
people who do spot treatments later on in the season, they often use
Yes. Yes.
shielded nozzles and try assiduously to avoid any contact with green tissue on the grapevine.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. We talked about some of the other herbicides and shielded sprays. Definitely keep that spray from getting up into the tissue. Oh, kudzu. Any ideas for kudzu management? Wow. Yeah. That's a new one for me. I really am going to have to get in touch with you on the kudzu. Both for what would be the appropriate strategy close to the crop, as well as the appropriate strategy in that forested area. I don't know if kudzu is the same as like tree of heaven, where there are, cut stump treatments that can be done. Because like in Washington, we had a tree of heaven that was growing in a wooded area and was starting to move up into cherry trees by a root growth. Kudzu, yeah, I'm gonna have to look up information on kudzu. Alternative to row spraying of herbicides, recommended radius from the trunk. You mean I'm assuming to keep the spray away from the trunk. And I'm assuming contact herbicides. That's a good question. Where the label requirements are, don't come into to contact with green tissue or foliage. So I'm not sure that I have seen an actual radius, recommended distance. Tim, have you seen that?
Radiated distance I'm sorry.
I'm assuming a radius away from the trunk, like be 6 inches away, 8 inches away, 3 inches away. Most things are contact with foliage, but I'm not sure that I've seen any kind of hard, fast distance, the X amount away from,
Yeah. For glyphosate specifically.
I think for any herbicide, it doesn't say.
Yeah. Well, when people apply pre-emergence, they generally don't use shielded nozzles. They generally go on pretty early in the season.
Right. Yeah, I think
April and May.
Maybe we're thinking the contacts.
And the contacts, yeah. And if they are just strictly contacts, sometimes people use them for suckering. They've used paraquat for that, for example. And I'm not a big fan of paraquat because it's so dangerous to the applicator.
Right.
But I think they've used glyphosate for that. We have some guidelines on that in the New York, Pennsylvania Pest Management Guidelines book. So I recommend that people, for very specific recommendations, go to that book.
Yeah. Tim and Becky, I know I haven't taken all the questions, but I have another event to get to. Is this a problem? I'm sorry.
No, I think that's fine. You've answered a number of the questions.
Okay.
And we really appreciate you taking the time to answer as many as you can. I know today's kind of a crazy day for you.
It is. I'm sorry. There's a town hall from Cornell that I kind of need to attend.
Don't worry about it. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It was a really wonderful presentation with a ton of useful information.
So my apologies to everyone whose question I did not answer. It's lms438@cornell.edu. If I can provide you an answer to a question I didn't answer, or clarification to a question that I didn't answer necessarily well.
Yeah,
great.
And we can also capture these questions that are written down and respond to them. And
yeah, and I'll also be sure that in the email that I send to everyone who attended the meeting, I'll include Lynn's email in there, so everybody has your contact information.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thanks again, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay, so thank you everybody so much for attending today's webinar. And if you're interested in a recording of this webinar, we are going to upload it to the Northern Grapes Project website. And I will also include a link to that in an email that I'm going to send around that you should get this afternoon. Please keep an eye out for that email because there will be a survey in it regarding today's webinar. Shouldn't take you more than 5 minutes. It's really short, and it just kind of helps us have a better understanding of how the session went for all of you that participated. And it also helps us improve any future webinars we're going to have. So I wanted to thank Lynn for the great presentation, and thank all of you attendees who took the time to join us despite the craziness of the world right now. And I hope all of you can join us for any future webinars that we will have. That'll be circulated in the exact same way that today's were. And you can go ahead and see information about other projects that have been done as part of the Northern Grapes Project, and future webinars, which will be posted on the website. So thank you so much. Looks like we have a couple of hands raised, so I will deal with that. Great. Thank you all so much. I'm going to end the meeting now.